Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear students, this is Dr. Anupriya from Sri Ramachandra Medical College and Research Institute, Chennai. In this lecture, I will be talking on the histology of pituitary and suprarenal glands. At the end of the session, the students should be able to describe the parts of the pituitary and the suprarenal glands, mention the cell types with their pattern of arrangement in each part, describe the functions of each cell type, describe the ultrastructure of pituitary and suprarenal glands. Coming to the difference between an endocrine gland, which is called as ductless gland, and an exocrine gland, which is called as duct glands. The endocrine secretions formed in the cells are poured into the surrounding connective tissues, which in turn are poured directly into the surrounding blood capillaries. Whereas in an exocrine gland, the secretions are poured into the lumen of the acini, which are carried by the ducts to the target regions. The endocrine glands synthesize and secretes chemical messengers known as hormones. Hormones are poured into the bloodstream where they may act on specific target organs or affect a wide range of organs and tissues. Along with autonomic nervous system, endocrine coordinates and controls the metabolic activities and internal environment of the body. The endocrine cells will be present as a whole gland. An endocrine gland, example, pituitary, thyroid gland, adrenal glands, whereas it can also be present as groups of cells inside an organ. For examples, the islet cells in pancreas, the interstitial cells of testis, the follicles of ovary, and etc. It can be present as an isolated endocrine cells, example neuroendocrine glands, Aput cells, that is amine precursor uptake and decarboxylation cells. The hormones produced by the endocrine cells enter the circulatory system to reach the target organs. These target cells have specific receptors which accepts the hormones and absorbs them. Depending on the chemical structure of the hormone, there are different types of hormones. The amino acid derivatives hormones, example adrenaline, noradrenaline, thyroxine. The small peptide hormones, example vasopressin, thyroid releasing hormone. The proteins hormones, example insulin, parathormone. The steroid hormones, example progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, and cortisols. There is a feedback mechanism to regulate the hormonal function. The arrangement of endocrine cells are as a cord or a clump of cells, where the secretions are poured into the surrounding connective tissues, which are in turn directly absorbed into the blood capillaries. In a follicular type of arrangement, the secretions are poured into the lumen of the acini, where the blood is then again absorbed into the blood capillaries. Before knowing the histological features of the pituitary and adrenal glands, let's know some clinical conditions related to these glands. This first picture shows a condition called as acromegaly, which is caused by excessive production of growth hormone in adults. The most commonest cause is pituitary adenoma. The features like enlargement of hands and feet, deepening of voice, thick skin, coarseness of facial features with increased soft tissues, prominent supraorbital ridge, and more prominent lower jaw leading to prognathisms are seen. The second picture shows a condition called as Cushing's syndrome. This is due to overproduction of cortisol by the adrenal gland or excessive intake of cortisol due to medications. There is abnormal deposition of fats between the shoulders. The skin is very thick, which are more prone for bruise producing pink or purple stretch marks, presence of facial hairs and irregular menstrual cycle in females. Coming to the pituitary gland, which is also called as hypophysis cerebri. This is suspended from the floor of the third ventricle by a narrow funnel shaped stalk called the infundibulum, and it is located in the bony cavity of the sphenoid bone called as sella turcica. Pituitary glands produces several hormones, some of which influences the activities of other endocrine tissues. Hence, pituitary gland is called the master gland amongst the endocrine glands. Its own activity, in fact, is influenced by the hypothalamus and by the pineal gland. The pituitary hormones fall into two functional groups. The hormones which acts on non-endocrine glands, example the growth hormone which acts on the skeletal system, the prolactin which acts on the mammary gland and uterus in a pregnant and lactating women, antidiuretic hormone which acts on the kidney tubules, oxytocin which again acts on the uterus and the mammary gland, melanocyte stimulating hormone which acts in the skin to produce melanin. The hormones which regulates the secretion of other endocrine glands are the other group, like thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, gonadotropic hormones, follicle stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones. Coming to the parts of pituitary gland, it has an anterior part called as the pars anterior, also called as pars distalis, which extends above and surrounds the infundibular stalk, which is called as pars tuberalis. There is an intermediate area called as pars intermedia and a posterior part called as pars posterior or pars nervosa. The pituitary gland anatomically has two lobes. Adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary lobe, which includes the pars anterior and the pars tuberalis along with the pars intermedia. Neurohypophysis is the posterior part that includes the posterior pars posterior along with the infundibular stalk. The infundibular stalk hangs from the floor of the third ventricle. The region of the floor is called as tuber cinerarium and the region surrounding this tuber cinerarium is called as median eminence. So, the pars distalis, the pars tuberalis and the pars intermedia forms the anterior lobe, which is called as adenohypophysis. Embryologically, they develop from the Rathke's pouch from the roof of the primitive oral cavity. After full development, sometimes there is remnants of these Rathke's pouch and it is called as the intraglandular cleft. The pars tuberalis, which extends from the pars distalis, it surrounds the infundibulum. These anterior pituitary glands will have secretory cells which secretes the hormones directly and pour into the surrounding sinusoids. The posterior pituitary lobe, which has the pars posterior along with the infundibulum, is also called as neurohypophysis. This also includes the median eminence. This develops from the downward growth of the hypothalamus. That means the origin has got a nervous tissue. Hence, this the posterior pituitary lobe is completely different from the anterior pituitary. It contains nerve fibers which extends from the hypothalamus and it ends in the pars posterior and it stores the hormones secreted from the hypothalamus. The blood supply of pituitary gland is very interesting. The superior and the inferior hypophyseal arteries are the main arteries which are branches of the internal carotid artery. The superior hypophyseal artery supplies the median eminence, the infundibular stalk, and it forms a capillary plexus. This capillary plexus is called as primary capillary plexus. The veins from the primary capillary plexus comes down towards the pars anterior and it forms sinusoids and a capillary plexus which is called as secondary capillary plexus. The veins which drains it, they are called as the hypophyseal portal veins. This kind of arrangement is quite unique in pituitary gland and hence it is called as hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, because this is the only region where there are two capillary plexus between an artery and a vein. The inferior hypophyseal artery supplies the pars nervosa. The capillary plexus surrounds the cells present in the pars nervosa. So, the hormones which are stored here, when stimulated appropriately, will pour into these capillary plexus. Now, we will see the microscopic feature of pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary lobe is made up of secretory cells which are arranged as cords or acini. These acini are surrounded by blood-filled sinusoids. Pars intermedia has colloid-filled vesicles which represents the Rathke's pouch. Apart from this, there are some groups of cells which produces melanocyte stimulating hormone. The posterior pituitary is made up of nerve fibers which extends from hypothalamus. There are also some supporting cells called pituocytes. To explain in detail, the adenohypophysis consists of cords of cells which are separated by sinusoids which are fenestrated. They are supported by a network of reticular fibers. Several types of cells are responsible for the production of different hormones. Based on the staining properties of the cells of the anterior pituitary, there are two groups of cells. The chromophil cells, which have brightly stained granules in their cytoplasm, and chromophobe cells, in which the granules are not very prominent and they are comparatively small and present in clusters. The chromophil cells, depending on the types of dyes it observes, have two groups: the acidophils, also called as alpha cells, where the granules stains with acid dyes like eosin, orangey, etc. Whereas basophil cells, also called as beta cells, where the granule stains with basic dyes like hematoxin. Electron microscopic examination shows that both acidophil and basophil cells contain abundant dense cord vesicles in the cytoplasm. Both acidophils and basophils can be divided into subtypes on the basis of the size and shape of the granules in them. These findings have been correlated with those obtained by immunochemical methods. Coming to the different cell types, somatotropes produce the somatotropic hormone, also called as somatotropin or growth hormone. This hormone controls the body growth, especially before puberty. The next cell is mammotropes or lactotrophs, which produces the mammotropic hormone, also called the mammotropin or prolactin lactogenic hormone or LTH. This hormone stimulates the growth and activity of the female mammary gland during pregnancy and lactation. The corticotropes or corticotropes produce the corticotropic hormone, also called adrenocorticotropin or ACTH. This hormone stimulates the secretion of some hormones of the adrenal cortex. The next is thyrotropes or thyrotropes produces the thyrotropic hormone, thyrotropin or TCH, which stimulates the activity of the thyroid gland. The chromophobe cells secretes gonadotropes. Gonadotropes or delta basophils produces two types of hormones, each type having a different action in a male and female. The first type is follicle stimulating hormone FSH. In the female, the first of these hormones stimulates the growth of ovarian follicles. It also stimulates the secretion of estrogen by the ovaries. Whereas in the male, the same hormone stimulates spermatogenesis. The second type is luteinizing hormone LH. In the female, It stimulates the maturation of corpus luteum and in turn the secretion of the progesterone. Whereas in the male, the same hormone stimulates the production of androgens by the interstitial cells of the testis, and it's called the interstitial cell stimulating hormone. The chromophil cells do not stain darkly. There are very few granules inside it. Immunohistochemical study reveals it represents various types of chromophils, and it is considered as a degranulated part of chromophils. Whereas coming to the distribution of cells, the somatotrophs occupies 50% of the cell population, and it occupies the lateral part of the anterior pituitary. The mammotrophs, which is 25%, it's almost scattered throughout the anterior pituitary. Corticotrophs, which is around 15 to 20%, occupies the posterior and median parts, whereas thyrotrophs occupies the anterior and the median parts. The gonadotrophs, which is 10%, is scattered throughout. Pars intermedia features presence of colloid-filled vesicles which are lined by cuboidal cells. These vesicles are considered as remnants of Rathke's pouch. Apart from the vesicles, there are beta cells, other secretory cells and chromophore cells present. Some cells in the pars intermedia produces melanocyte stimulating hormone, which causes increased pigmentation of the skin. Coming to the next part, the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. The cells in the posterior consist of numerous unmyelinated nerve fibers, which are the axons of neurons located in the hypothalamus. Most of the nerve fibers arises in the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei. In the posterior pituitary, the terminal ends of the axons from the hypothalamus are present as neurosecretory bodies, also called as herring bodies. Hormones are temporarily stored in these locations. Situated between these axons, there are supporting cells of special types called pituocytes. The hormones of the posterior pituitary are the vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin is also called the antidiuretic hormone. This hormone controls reabsorption of water by kidney tubules. Oxytocin it controls the contraction of smooth muscle of the uterus and the mammary gland. The hormones in the neurohypophysis, they are synthesized actually in the neurons located in the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. Vasopressin is produced in the supraoptic nucleus and oxytocin is in the paraventricular nucleus. These secretion passes down the axons of the neurons concerned through the infundibulum into the pars posterior. Here, they are released into the capillaries of the region and they enter the general circulation. Coming to the control of pituitary gland, the hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibitory hormones which controls the secretion of the hormones from the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary, which secretes growth hormones which acts on the bones and the soft tissues. The adrenocorticotropic hormones will act on the adrenal gland, which in turn will regulate the secretion of adrenocorticosteroids. The thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid gland to regulate the thyroid hormones. The follicle stimulating and the luteinizing hormone act separately in females on the corpus luteum to stimulate the secretion of progesterone hormones, on the ovary to stimulate the estrogen, whereas in males it acts on testis to regulate the secretion of testosterone. The oxytocin from the posterior pituitary will act on the uterus and the breast, whereas the antidiuretic or vasopressin will act in the kidney. Depending on the blood level of these final hormones, it further gives a feedback mechanism and which goes and stimulates or inhibit the hypothalamus, which in turn will again stimulate or inhibit the production of hormones by the pituitary gland. The microscopic features of pituitary shows a cluster of cells in the anterior pituitary. These are the secretory cells which are surrounded by the sinusoids. In the pars intermedia, there are colloid filled vesicles and some melanocyte stimulating hormone secreting cells, whereas in posterior pituitary, the nerve endings have herring bodies which stores the hormones temporarily, and these are supported by pituocytes. Coming to the applied histology of pituitary gland, gigantism is a condition where there is excessive production of growth hormone prior to the epiphyseal closure. There is enlargement of bones which leads to increase in height and enlarged thoracic cavity. Acromegaly is also overproduction of growth hormone, but in adults. The features like enlargement of hands and feet, coarseness of facial features, prominent supraorbital ridge, prominent lower jaw with protrusions are seen. Diabetes insipidus is due to deficiency of antidiuretic hormone, also called as vasopressin. There is excretion of large amount of diluted urine, which leads to condition called as polyuria and polydipsia. Pituitary adenoma is a benign tumor which causes hyperpituitarism like prolactinoma, which leads to condition called galacturia, hypogonadism and infertility. The treatment is surgical excision. Summarizing the features of pituitary gland, the pituitary gland is divided into anterior pituitary, pars anterior, an intermediate lobe called as pars intermediate, and a posterior pituitary called as pars nervosa. A hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system helps in transmission of hormones from the hypothalamus, which influences the pituitary hormones. Coming to the types of cells in the anterior pituitary, the chromophil cells like acidophils and basophils. There are chromophobe cells which are less stains. In the posterior pituitary, the presence of pituocytes, the supporting cells and herring bodies which are storage cells for the hormones. The acidophil cells which stains with acid dyes produces growth hormone and prolactin. The basophil cells which stains with basic dyes produces thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Whereas in the pars intermedia, there is a group of cells which produces melanocyte stimulating hormone which influences the pigmentation of the skin. The posterior pituitary produces oxytocin which influences the smooth muscle contraction of uterus and mammary gland, and antidiuretic hormone, also called as vasopressin, which influences the reabsorption of water in the kidney tubules. Now we come to the next gland, the suprarenal or adrenal gland. These glands are located in the upper pole of the kidney. There are two functionally distinct parts, a yellow superficial cortex and a reddish brown deep medulla. Adrenal gland has two distinct functionally and embryologically different components. The adrenal cortex secretes steroid hormones, controls the electrolyte and fluid balance, has effects on proteins and lipid metabolism, and it also supplements gonadal sex hormones. Whereas the adrenal medulla, it's considered as sympathetic nervous functionally. Coming to the microscopic features of suprarenal or adrenal glands, these glands are covered by connective tissue, the capsule which sends septa into the substances. The stroma has reticular fibers. The outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex is based on the secretory cells arrangement is again divided into outermost zona glomerulosa, middle zona fasciculata and the innermost part called as zona reticularis.
The outermost layer is called as zona glomerulosa. This forms the outer 1/5 of the cortex. The cells are arranged as inverted U-shaped cords which are closely packed, and they are surrounded by capillaries. They are small polyhedral or columnar with basophilic cytoplasm and deeply stained nucleus. This layer, the cells, they produce hormones called mineralocorticoid hormones, which are aldosterone and deoxycorticosterone. These hormones helps to balance electrolyte and water. They are influenced by renin of juxtaglomerular cells. The middle layer is called as zona fasciculata, which forms the middle 3/5 of the cortex. The cells are arranged in straight columns. The cells are large polyhedral basophilic cells with a vesicular nuclei. Some cells looks empty because they are rich in lipids and vitamin C. They are called as spongiocytes. These cells produce glucocorticoid hormones, which are cortisones and cortisols, dehydrocortisones. These hormones, they affect the carbohydrate and protein metabolism. They also have an anti-inflammatory effect. They also produce an androgen called as dehydroepiandrosterone, DHA. The third layer of the cortex, which is the innermost 1/5 layer, is called as zona reticularis. The cells are arranged in cords which anastomose with each other. These cells are small, acidophilic. Cytoplasm is eosinophilic, which contains lipofuscin pigment granules. These cells produce hormones called as glucocorticoids and sex hormones like estrogen and androgen. Coming to the electron microscope features of adrenal cortex cells, there are abundant smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Golgi complex are well seen in zona fasciculata. The mitochondria are elongated in zona glomerulosa. They are spherical in zona fasciculata and tubular in zona reticularis. The medulla of the adrenal gland functions as a modified sympathetic ganglion with postganglionic cells. They contain chromaffin cells and sympathetic ganglion cells. The chromaffin cells are columnar or polyhedral basophilic with a basophilic cytoplasm. They are arranged in cords and clumps. The cell groups are separated by sinusoids. The cytoplasm is light basophilic with an hematoxylin and eosin stain. Chromaffin reaction means the tissue fixation is done with potassium bichromate, which shows fine brown granules in the cells of medulla. Coming to the electronic microscopic features of the adrenal medulla cells, there are abundant granular endoplasmic reticulum, prominent Golgi complexes, and the vesicles present are small electron dense, which contains noradrenaline, and large less electron dense, which contains adrenaline.
The hormones produced are catecholamines, which are noradrenaline and adrenaline. They are secreted during stress, similar to the sympathetic nervous system, and this secretion is controlled by splanchnic nerves. Coming to the applied histology of suprarenal gland. When there is a decreased secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone due to destruction of a suprarenal cortex, it leads to a condition called as Addison's disease. Whereas when there is excessive secretions of these hormones because of a tumor in the basophilic cells of anterior pituitary, it leads to a condition called as Cushing's disease. Pheochromocytoma is a tumor of the adrenal medulla where there is hypersecretion of catecholamines, which leads to hypertension.
So let's summarize the microscopic features of the suprarenal gland. The suprarenal gland is divided microscopically into outer cortex and inner medulla. The cortex is again divided into outer 1/5 zona glomerulosa, the middle 3/5 zona fasciculata, and the inner 1/5 zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa, the cells are columnar cells which are arch-shaped, and they secrete aldosterone, which helps in water and electrolyte balance. The zona fasciculata, they are polygonal cells which are arranged as straight cords. They secrete glucocorticoids, which helps in protein, fats, and glucose metabolism. The zona reticularis is polygonal cells which are irregularly arranged. They secrete sex hormones, which influences the masculinizing features. The medulla has chromaffin cells and sympathetic ganglion cells. Let's have a small assessment Which cells are seen in pars nervosa of pituitary gland? Pars nervosa means pars posterior of the pituitary. The options are A. Acidophils, B. Basophils, C. Chromophobes, D. Pituicytes. The acidophils and basophils are chromophils groups. So they are present in anterior of the pituitary gland. Whereas chromophobes also belongs to the pars anterior. Hence, pituicytes are present in the pars posterior of the pituitary gland. So the answer is pituicytes. Diabetes insipidus is due to deficiency of which hormone? Option A, oxytocin. Option B, vasopressin. Option C, insulin. Option D, renin. Oxytocin is secreted in the pars posterior. It influences the smooth muscle of uterus and mammary glands. Insulin is secreted in pancreas. Renin is secreted by juxtaglomerular cells. Whereas vasopressin, which is also secreted in pars posterior of pituitary gland, it influences the reabsorption of water from the distal convoluted tubules of nephrons, hence decreasing the excessive excretion of water into the urine. It is also called as antidiuretic hormone. The deficiency of vasopressin will lead to a condition called as diabetes insipidus. Hence, the answer is vasopressin. Catecholamines are produced in which part of adrenal gland? The zona glomerulosa, fasciculata and reticularis belongs to the cortex. The catecholamines are secreted in the adrenal medulla. Excessive secretion of cortisol leads to a condition called as Addison's disease, option B, Cushing's disease, option C, acromegaly, option D, pheochromocytoma. The excessive secretion of cortisols are seen in Cushing's syndrome. With this, we end the topic.